Welcome, everyone, to the third day of BugFest Plan B. We are so excited you are joining us here today. As folks come in and get started with joining audio and get settled, we have an icebreaker question for you. So I want to know, what do you think is the number one threat to bees? So put your answer in the chat. And while you do that, I'm going to go ahead and go to the beginning of my presentation because I didn't notice I was at the end. All right, here we go. So we're going to go through a quick Zoom tutorial just to make sure that we maximize your Zoom experience. So first of all, we are recording this presentation. It will be on YouTube, the museum's BugFest Plan B playlist on our YouTube channel. So we will not be allowing visitors to have their videos on or their mics unmuted. So keep those videos off and those mics muted. We are offering live captions. So if you would like to use the captions, click that button down at the bottom and click Show Subtitle. Subtitles are going to look like this, and you'll have those for the duration of the presentation. Now, we also want you to make sure that your view is looking the way we want it to. So if you see in our example, our bee is on top of the flower. So we don't want the bee to obscure the flower. So up at the top, we're going to, at View Options, you're going to click Speaker View. And that makes the and to do side by side, you want speaker view and side by side mode, and then that moves our bee off the flower, and so you can see both, and nothing is obscured. You can also adjust the size of your of the slide when the screen's being shared by pulling that bar back and forth. All right, lastly, we want you to use the chat. We love hearing from you. Please put all your questions, comments, observations in that chat. But remember, please be a good digital citizen. Do not spam the chat, and make sure that all of your chats are relevant to the topic at hand, and be kind and respectful to everyone. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. David Tarpey is a professor of applied ecology at NC State University. So he's broadly interested in the biology and behavior of honeybees, with projects investigating their mating system and genetic diversity, molecular and pollination ecology, oxidative stress and social immunity, disease ecology, and queen reproductive quality. So lots of amazing bee stuff. So he's an editor for the Journal of Economic Entomology and Apidology, and has been awarded numerous awards, including being named a university faculty scholar at NC State in 2015. So Dr. Tarpey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Carrie, and thanks to all the museum staff working very hard behind the scenes. And kudos again for having yet another successful BugFest online. I'm really excited to participate today, and I'm great to see that this is being so well received yet again, and everybody for attending. So thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen.
Sure. So I've got a couple answers that people had for the number one threat for bees. So Buxton says habitat destruction and trees being cut down. The Bruns family says pesticides. So some good answers there.
Exactly. We should be covering all of those. All of those topics are very, very relevant and very important. But my purpose here today is really to talk about the full context of the bee crisis, and especially to try to better understand some of the misinformation and the misconceptions that are out there. I think when it comes to the issues that all bees have been facing, especially in the media, a lot of the nuance is just glossed over. And so sometimes those very subtle differences are really, really important to to overcome some of this misunderstanding. So my purpose here today is to really go over some of the misconceptions that a lot of the general public seems to have about the problems that bees are facing, and to try to rectify those and discuss what they really mean in the full context of the bee crisis. So one of the first misconceptions that is really, really common is that anything that flies and might sting you is a bee. In fact, I just had 2 calls this morning about this that had some killer bees that were out there, but instead they were actually wasps. And so, these yellow stripy things are often misconstrued with bees, and they're often synonymized. And that's not the case at all. And in fact, yellow jackets are a type of wasp, and they often give honeybees a really, really bad name. But really, they're very, very different. And there's a reason why most people in their interactions with yellow stripy things are fairly negative. And that's because most of the wasps are predatory, that they're predators like these yellow jackets, and they're much, much more likely to sting. Bees, on the other hand, are vegans. They only get their meat, their protein sources are pollen. And so they're only getting their food from flowers, from plants. And so they really are much less likely to sting. They're only going to sting in defense of their nest. And so most people who get stung by insects, 80% of them are yellow jackets or other wasp species. And so when we conflate the two of, anything that might fly and sting you as a bee, it's really giving bees a bad name. So let's make sure, wasps are important in their own right, but not everything that might sting you is a bee. So let's make sure that we're clear on that distinction. Corollary to that, the second misconception that is out there is that all bees are the same. So not just all bees, all wasps are not bees. Not all bees are the same. And in fact, bees are incredibly speciose. There's a huge number of bees, about 20,000 plus worldwide. 4,000 of them are native to North America. And our best guess is about 560 or so are native to North Carolina alone. And they're very different from each other in size and coloration, in their life histories, just beautiful diversity of all the different bees that are out there. And so the ones that are commonly occurring in North Carolina are these here, many of which you're familiar with, like the sweat bees and bumblebees, as well as others that you might not have heard of. And then, of course, our state insect, which is the honeybee, which in fact is not even native to North America at all. They were imported from the old world, from Europe, with the first European settlers. So not all bees are the same. And most of the bees in North Carolina, except for bumblebees and honeybees, the vast majority of all these 20,000 species worldwide are solitary living. That is, individual female bees that are making their own nests, they're reproducing on their own, and they are not living together in a colony. However, honeybees, which again, state insect of North Carolina and kind of one of the quintessential bee species that most people are familiar with, they live in colonies. They're social insects. So they live in colonies of 50,000 or so individuals and collectively work together as a unit rather than individual solitary bees like most of the bees are. So when we make the distinction, when we just kind of lump all bees together, we're doing them a disservice in not recognizing their diversity and in the way that they live. So honeybees are actually not representative of most bees because most bees are solitary living rather than living in colonies. A third misconception that's out there that's probably not as commonplace as it used to be, but it used to be thought, at least, that bees are really only important for honey, right? That bees only serve a purpose of, providing us honey. And while honey is indeed a product of honeybees, not all of the other bees, and there are many different types of honey that are out there, their production of honey as a food source, as a sweetener for us as humans, pales in comparison to their true importance, which is their integral role in cross-pollination of plants. Now, again, I think most people now recognize the role that bees have as pollinators. But in essence, bees are the go-between between different flowers of the same species, and they're carrying the pollen from one flower to another. And in doing so, they're cross-pollinating. They're putting the pollen from one flower to the female structures of another flower, and that allows for fertilization and reproduction of that particular plant. Without that fertilization, you then don't get the seed set and then the fruit set around those seeds. So if it weren't for pollination, you wouldn't get a lot of the fruits, vegetables, and nuts and other things that are produced from that cross-pollination. And so about 100 different crops that are grown are either entirely or partially reliant on insect pollination to go back and forth between these blossoms to carry the pollen and therefore enable seed and fruit set. And so it's been estimated that bees are responsible for about a third of everything we eat. And so it's really, really important then to our food supply that every third bite of food that we take can be traced back to bee pollination in some form or fashion. Now, it's been shown in some really excellent studies that the native bees, these solitary living native bee populations, very speciose bee population, bee communities, are not sufficient to provide this cross-pollination service for a lot of these different crops. And so the darker areas on this map here are indicative of those areas where what is being grown in those areas doesn't have the native bee communities that are sufficient to provide that pollination service. And so a lot of where our food is grown, there aren't enough bees to go around to be able to provide that pollination. As a result, beekeepers transport colony living honeybee colonies and living in hives, and they transport them sometimes by the flatbed on an entire truck. And they ship them all the way across the United States and back again. And so there's an annual migration of managed beehives by beekeepers to bring them in and out of the fields and orchards of these bee-dependent crops. And as a result, temporarily providing that pollination service before they're packed up again and then moved somewhere else. So it's been estimated that an average beehive in the United States travels 8,000 miles a year to go from the East Coast out to the West Coast, back up to the Dakotas for honey production, then maybe up to northern Maine for blueberries, and then back down to Florida. So they can travel quite a bit every single year to fill the void that is left by having this paucity of native bees in the landscape.
So we have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so Aliel has a question. How many years have we been having to transport bees to do this pollination work?
For decades. We've been doing this for a very long time. So this is not a relatively new thing, although as I might mention later on, it used to be when our farming systems was mostly family farms. Most family farms had a hive or two behind the barn. But with the consolidation of farms and the larger scale of farms, apiculture has followed suit, where the scale of beekeeping has gotten bigger and bigger. And so they've been moving their hives in and out of the fields since then. So it's really a reflection of the greater trends in overall commercial production agriculture. So if we were to boil down the contributions, the economic contributions of pollination of these 100 or so different crops, the native solitary bees account for roughly half of the pollination and the contribution of the fruits and vegetables that are produced from pollination. But honeybees account for approximately the other half. So both are equally important. Our managed honeybees that live in colonies and are transported around by beekeepers account for about half of the productivity of the food that we eat, of the bee pollinated food that we eat. But the native bees account for the other half. And so we can't neglect one over the other. We definitely need both within the system. So just to visually see what this would look like in a world without bees, we can look at our breakfast plate. So, a breakfast with bees has nuts and dried fruits in the granola. It would have jam on your toast, fruit salad. Even the milk in your coffee can result from bees pollinating alfalfa, which then is grown and fed as hay to our cows, right? So even milk products have some sort of connection to bees and other pollinators. And so breakfast without bees looks much more stark and is not nearly as nutritious. A similar visual, if you just look at the Whole Foods market, the produce aisles in Whole Foods with bees and without bees. So as you can see, most of the fruits, vegetables, nuts, the healthy things that we consume in our diet rely on bees very heavily. And so bees are really important, not just for honey, but for pollination. A fourth misconception that one can often get from just simply reading the headlines is that all bees are dead and they've all died from this new mysterious thing called colony collapse disorder, or CCD. And this is a misconception in several ways. One, not all bees are affected by colony collapse disorder, only honeybees are. Again, most bees are solitary. They don't live in colonies. So by definition, colony collapse disorder cannot affect these native solitary bees. Only that happens in honeybees because they have colonies. But moreover, what we see in honeybee colonies in colony collapse disorder is this very rapid depopulation of the colonies. So they go from 50,000 bees down to just a few hundred or a few thousand very, very quickly. And we didn't really understand at the time, 10 plus years ago, as to why this was occurring. And in many ways, we still don't. But it was very sensational. And so it made a lot of headlines. And there was a huge avalanche of media reports on the plight that honeybees were occurring, what was happening with colony collapse disorder. But again, this was often synonymized then with all bees and them all the only reason why they're dying. But in reality, what we see in the managed honeybee population is that the number of colonies that were dying off every year has varied over time, but it has been averaging around 40% of the managed honeybee colonies in the US have been dying off every single year, which is really, really shocking and very problematic. And that's why the story has been very, very sensational. And this has been far above what beekeepers themselves have defined as being kind of an acceptable turnover rate of their colonies. But when asking beekeepers as to why those colonies are failing, why those colonies are dying off every year, colony collapse disorder is really a minority issue, and it always has been. Most of the reasons why colonies seem to not be doing well and dying off are kind of known and explained causes. Things like they don't have enough forage and they don't have enough food to make it through the winter, or parasites and other problems. And so colony collapse disorder has always been a minority issue for honeybee colonies. And so if we look at the entire managed honeybee population in the US, and 40% of those colonies are dying off every single year, well, about a quarter of those don't have explained reasons of why they're dying off, and only a portion of those have symptoms that are consistent with colony collapse disorder. So if you take the actual number of colonies that were afflicted with this kind of mysterious syndrome, really only about 3% of the colonies were dying from this issue at the height of its problem, and now it's even more rare. So all the colony mortality, the reason why honeybee colonies are dying off in unsustainable numbers is not synonymized with colony collapse disorder. They're not one and the same. There's many reasons why colonies are dying off. Not all of them are CCD. In fact, most of them are not. What researchers and beekeepers generally agree on, or some of the main reasons why colonies are dying off, are threefold, and they're interacting, so they're not mutually exclusive. One is nutritional stress, particularly because of habitat loss. So honeybees need pollen and nectar from many different blossoms out there. And so something that's ideal for them is a diverse and abundant supply of natural blossoms so that they can have a diverse diet, just like it's good and healthy for us. But in agriculture, when the bees are being moved in and out of different agricultural settings, they can often see a food desert where they have these large monoculture crops that may have blossoms, but the pollen and or nectar in those blossoms may not be as nutritionally satisfying or sufficient for them. And so colonies can be under nutritional stress when they're being used for their pollination services. So nutritional stress and habitat loss are certainly a major driver of why colonies may be dying off in unsustainable numbers.
I've got another question that's pretty relevant to that. So Elise wants to know, is there a reason why we breed honeybees for pollination instead of diversifying to match the wild bees? And is it just because they're easier to take care of or keep together?
That's a really great question. The reason why honeybees are kind of the workhorse for pollination in agriculture is because they are amenable to domestication or semi-domestication. They live in colonies, we can put them in boxes and we can move them around, and they live year-round. The native wild bees that are solitary and living on their own, they're living, they're nesting in the ground or in twigs or in other locations. So we can't put them into a box and move them around. They're wild living, they're natural systems. So it's much, much harder then to try to manipulate their numbers in a given area. And so because honeybees are social insects, they're much more amenable to this type of application. And that's why they're used in that way. That isn't to say that we shouldn't be caring about the native bees. It's just that we're not able to manage them and use them for that same purpose. But that's a great question and a great point. So a second category of different issues that honeybees have been facing is environmental contamination, particularly through exposure to pesticides. And so, what is good at killing off a pest insect in an agricultural setting is usually pretty good at killing off a beneficial insect like a bee. And so this has always been problematic for bees and beekeepers as they're going into these different areas. And so this has been an area of great concern for beekeepers and environmentalists. It's a very complicated issue, and there isn't kind of one smoking gun or kind of one single pesticide that is responsible for colony collapse disorder, but how it interacts with some of these other stressors and factors is very hard to tease apart, but we know that clearly this plays a central role in the problems that bees have been facing. And then finally, the third kind of area of problems that is associated with colony collapse and other problems is pathology, different parasites and pathogens. And because honeybees live in colonies, they have a whole host of different parasites and pathogens that can make them sick, because they're living together in such a dense environment that it's very easy for them to transmit different diseases across to each other. And so trying to keep the bees healthy from these different parasites and pathogens is what really keeps beekeepers busy in managing them as they're being used in this context. So that's just honeybees, right? So honeybees are the only ones that have colony collapse disorder. But all bees are facing similar, in fact, very overlapping challenges. So all bees are plagued by different parasites and pathogens. Some of them are shared, some of them are very different. But diseases is a major role in the pollinator problem that we see. The nutritional decline from loss of habitat is something that all bees share, as are pesticides and perhaps even other problems. And so the different factors, however, affect native versus honeybees in different ways, even though the underlying root causes may be the same. And they are all interacting with each other across these different species that makes a simple single solution a real challenge. So we really need to take a holistic approach to trying to address the problems that are facing all pollinators, not just one or another. A third misconception that's out there is that people are often making very bold statements, such as the known cause of colony collapse disorder is fill in the blank, whatever it is. And that's a misconception in the sense that there is no one cause. There are, as I was just saying, many different causes that lead to colony ill health within honeybees, but then problems with pollinators in general. And so there's the famous quote, of course, that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And so that filling in the blank of that statement is just that, that you can attribute the problems to honeybees to any one thing, but it's never going to be that simple. And with the kind of a vacuum of strong empirical evidence, there's lots of different, shall we say, low priority or low possible reasons that are causing CCD, such as divine rapture, that it was a terrorist plot, that aliens are somehow manipulating our bees and killing them off, to cell phones are killing our bees, none of which is true or really has any strong evidence to it. But nonetheless, there has been lots of discussion. And over the last 10 years or so, there have been some studies that have started to open up some possibilities as to why colony collapse disorder has been occurring. But each time, subsequent study has shown that those have been false alarms. So the first example of when the media kind of took hold of a study and tied a bow on the colony collapse disorder story, saying we've now found the reason why all of the bees are dying, was this first study that suggested that there's this one particular virus, Israeli acute paralysis virus, was very strongly associated with colonies that were collapsing, but not in colonies that were not collapsing. And so as a result, there were a huge snowball of different media reports that were saying that, well, we pretty much found the problem. Subsequent studies, however, have gone in and followed up and done similar work to try to see if this was indeed the case. And other studies have shown that that association was not as strong in collapsing colonies. So this IAPV was not as prevalent in collapsing colonies versus colonies that were seemingly healthy. So that was kind of a false alarm as to trying to answer this kind of simple, trying to attribute colony collapse disorder to a simple cause. The second false alarm was another paper that suggested that it was an interaction actually between a different virus and a gut parasite that is inside colonies, based on infecting bees with one or the other or both and finding a more significant effect of having a dual infection. And so again, the media kind of went wild and was suggesting that, oh, the mystery of the colony collapse has been solved based on this work. But again, subsequent studies come along looking at other populations of bees that have this same syndrome, and others have not been able to verify this. In fact, no other study has been able to actually determine the existence of this virus that these other researchers have found. And so, again, the question is still out as to whether or not this is a major factor behind colony collapse disorder. The third time that the media really picked up on honeybee studies that were looking at the underlying cause of colony collapse disorder was this one, looking at a particular class of pesticides called neonicotinoids, where they were feeding different doses of these neonicotinoid pesticides to honeybee colonies and then measuring their decline over time. So again, there was a huge sensation in the media saying that scientists have pinpointed what's killing all the honeybees. But when others have looked into this, or even looking into that very particular study, the media headlines were not really justified, because the control colonies, those colonies that were not fed these pesticides, died off just as much as the colonies that were fed whopping amounts of this pesticide, way more than they would actually be exposed to in the field. And so when your placebo control group doesn't have any benefit compared to the ones that are supposed to be dying off because of these pesticides, it really doesn't show that this is very strong evidence as to the underlying reason. A lot of the other factors within the bee system also were not controlled for. And so this study is really not very strong evidence one way or the other as far as any underlying cause for colony collapse disorder. So today, we still don't really know what caused CCD in honeybees. But I think most researchers for a while now have been rather focusing on a singular cause for this relatively rare reason why colonies were dying off. We're taking a much more holistic approach and generally agree that colony collapse disorder was multiple stressors interacting with each other in very complex ways that lead to these colony declines. So we need to focus our efforts on those different factors rather than trying to find this kind of one silver bullet of colony collapse disorder. The sixth misconception that is often seen associated with the problems with bees is this quote that is attributed to Albert Einstein. He said that if the bee disappeared off the face of the earth, man would only have 4 years left to live, which sounds very wise and everything. If Albert Einstein said it, then it must be true. However, looking into this, Albert Einstein actually never said this. So not only is that a misconception and a complete falsehood, the idea was that it was just trying to attribute a point about the importance of bees to somebody smart to give it credibility. So not only is it a misconception in the sense that Albert Einstein said it, it's also not entirely true, and this is why. Most of the staple crops that we eat every day are not pollinated by bees or other insects. They're wind pollinated because they're grasses, such as corn and wheat and rice. They don't rely on bees for their pollination. Now, because of that, most of the calories that we get in our everyday diet, if we were to just get rid of all honeybees, we would only see about a 5 to 10% of reduction in our food supply overall. But those crops that are very bee reliant, 85% of which are grown across the world, and those are the ones that are supplying the fruits and vegetables and the healthy part of our diet, right? So while most of our calories would still be there, we wouldn't starve to death. We wouldn't have the well-rounded natural diet that includes the fruits, vegetables, and nuts, because those crops are disproportionately pollinated by bees. So in order to have all of the different foods that you really need to be healthy, we need bees. But technically, we wouldn't go extinct and starve to death without bees, because there would still be other foods that we could eat. Now, a seventh misconception is that honeybees are going extinct, or they're endangered, or some other wording to that effect, where honeybees are at risk of no longer being around. And that's another misconception that is often, again, based in a kernel of truth, in the sense that there's this widely reported figure that was generated from just before CCD kind of hit the headlines, by the National Academy of Sciences, where they were looking at the long-term trends of managed beehives in the United States. So just after World War II, there was a height of around 6 million managed beehives in the US, and that number has slowly declined over time, so that we have between 2.5 to 3 million beehives. So a very slow, not precipitous, but a slow decline of the number of beehives. Now, again, that is very complicated, and it's often attributed to some of those things that we were talking about before, the consolidation of family farms into larger and larger farms. And as a result, fewer farms had fewer beehives. And so there was more of a consolidation in apiculture as well. But there's lots of different demographic trends that go into this. But nonetheless, looking at this decline over time, they're saying, oh, there's a drop, there's a decline in the number of managed bees, and as a result, eventually they're going to go extinct. Well, there's a couple of things that is not completely accurate about that, is that if we go back before World War II, we see that the number of beehives was in fact lower, going back to the turn of the last century. And the reason that there was a peak in the number of beehives in the US right during and after World War II is that there was sugar rations for the war effort, and most of the sugar was being transported over to the troops. As a result, in order to get sweeteners back at the home front, keeping bees became really, really popular. And so there was a spike in World War II. And so taking the long-term trend from that peak is a little bit misleading. Secondly, since colony collapse disorder hit the headlines in 2006, 2007, when we had about 2.4 million beehives in the US, we've actually gone up a tick to about 2.8 currently in the last census. So there hasn't been a recent decline because of the issues that we've been talking about. This is a much longer term decline that is more than just issues dealing with bee health. This has led then to outright conspiracy theories saying that, well, because there are more beehives now than there were 10 years ago, there is no bee decline. This is all a kind of a big lie, right? So how does that kind of population data square with what we were talking about before, where 40% of honeybee colonies are dying off every single year? So how can both of those things be true? And the answer is actually quite simple. Beekeepers grow the bees back. They recoup their losses every single year, right? They are managed by beekeepers. And so it's not that if you start with 100 colonies and then 50% of them die off one year, and then 50% of them die off the next year, you're then left with 25% of what you started with. It's not an ever decreasing number. It's a fluctuating population, right? So what happens is that every year beekeepers lose on average about 40% of their colonies, but then they take their remaining colonies, they split them in half, and now they have 2 colonies again. And that's a lot easier said than done, but they're able to grow their populations back fairly quickly. You can't take a cow and split it in half and now you have 2 cows, right? But you can do that with social insects like honeybee colonies if you do it properly. And so if we just look at the last 10 years or so, where the population has been stable or even going up a little bit, This is the numbers that's being reported. But if you take into account the 40% dying off every year, the population is actually fluctuating and going up and down every single year quite dramatically, right? So it's a fluctuating, unstable population of honeybee colonies, not an ever decreasing one. And what makes it very problematic is that what happens if the beekeepers can't grow their populations back for one reason or another? Again, this is much easier said than done in order to keep up with the losses that beekeepers are experiencing. So it's very unsustainable to be able to be losing 40% of colonies every year and turning over this population. We need to focus on making that more stable so that we don't run the risk of not having enough colonies to be able to pollinate our crops. Now, that said, that's honeybees. Honeybees are not going extinct because they're managed, and beekeepers, at least up until now, have been able to grow them back. This is not the case for the native bee communities that are out there. They are declining. Those populations are diminishing over time and over relatively shorter periods of time. So again, some very nice work that has been published showing that the darker areas of this map here are where there are significantly lower abundances of many different important native bee species in the US that are contributing to our food supply. So honeybees really aren't the ones in danger. It's the native bees that are, again, because we can't manage them or affect their numbers in the same way that we can with social insects like honeybees. And so if you want to save the bees, if you want to help the bees, all bees, it really depends on what bees you're talking about. You need to think bigger, and we need to be better beekeepers in order to help the bees. So conserve our habitat, plant pollinator-friendly landscapes, provide pollen and nectar sources to bees. That helps all bees, honeybees, native bees, because by providing more things for them to eat, they're going to be able to reproduce more, and therefore their populations are going to be more stable. If you want to help conserve native bees, that is the solitary living ones that don't live in hives, but instead live out on their own, you can give them nesting habitats like these bee hotels, where they nest in wood or substrate or in the ground. So that's a great way to help the bees, help save the bees from their population declines. But if you want to help honeybees, it's not by making more and more hives, it's keeping the ones that are already existing healthy so that they survive. It's more of an issue of sustainability than it is conservation. In other words, if we look at all of the different native bees that are out there that are living on their own, they are analogous to songbirds, like wild songbirds, right? Where helping their habitat, helping their food and nesting substrates, that's the way to help wild living systems. But if you want to help honeybees, honeybees are more like chickens, right? They're managed at a large scale. We can grow them at will. And so helping these two different types of pollinators is very, very different. That in the end, the challenges facing native bees, because they're not managed, is through conservation efforts, through large landscape issues, and by promoting good habitat. Whereas the challenges facing honeybees is really only through addressing sustainability and sustainable agriculture, and making sure that they don't die off at record numbers as they are, but managing them in such a way that they're going to remain healthy and thriving. So while there's a lot of overlap in the way to help all pollinators, how we help honeybees is going to be very different from how we help native bee communities. So again, there's a lot of misconceptions out there, starting with anything that fly and might sting you is a bee. That's not entirely correct. Not all bees are the same. In fact, they're very different from each other. So understanding the differences is really critical. All bees are important pollinators, not just important for honey. Colony collapse disorder is actually very rare and only in honeybees. And it's not the case that all bees are dead and they've all died from CCD. There are multiple stressors that interact to help, that cause the problems that bees are facing. There is no one single cause of all the bee problems. Honeybees are managed and they're not going extinct. And then finally, without bees, we would mostly have gruel to eat, but it wouldn't be a very healthy diet. We wouldn't starve and go extinct ourselves. So there's a lot of distinctions without a difference perhaps there, but these are very important nuances that isn't really covered in the way that the bee crisis is being portrayed. And knowing and understanding these differences and these nuances, therefore, will help us help save the bees. And with that, I want to again thank the museum for allowing me to speak to you today. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, all right, that's awesome. So we have lots of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on them. Let's see. So Rhonda had a question about the neonicotinoids.
Yes.
Let me make sure I say that right. So she wants to know, I know you were saying that in that one study, they're showing that, that the study wasn't conducted very well, but her question is actually about native bees as well as honeybees. Do you think that those pesticides affect both of them?
Oh, absolutely. And there's no doubt that they are highly, highly toxic, that they are among the more highly toxic pesticides that are out there, insecticides, right? Because what's good at killing a pest insect is usually pretty good at killing off a beneficial insect. Now, honeybees, by and large, can be pretty robust to neonicotinoids compared to some of the native bee species. Some of the native bee species, it's not quite as toxic, even though it's still very toxic. Others are incredibly sensitive to them. So there's a lot of diversity in the toxicology to bees. But in general, yes, they are all very toxic. The question becomes the exposure to them and in what setting. That's where these things can get very complicated, because even at sublethal doses, the neonicotinoids and other pesticides can interact with parasites and nutrition and some of these other things to make things, worse. So it's not a direct route necessarily, that it's very complicated to be able to tease all of that out.
All right. So Azael has a question. They want to know where they can go to learn more about other ways to deter bugs from their home. Their parents want to use bug sprays, but not hurt the insects. So how can they learn more ways to help?
That's a really, really good question. And that's why this is very complicated, right? Is that there's no kind of other single solution to just deter bugs, right? So really what it comes down to is perhaps raising our threshold as to what we find acceptable, right? That the only good bug is a dead bug. We might want to rethink that, right? And so kind of realize that, we're part of nature and they're part of nature too. So living in some sort of harmony of that, but I get it. You don't want to be overrun with bugs inside your home. But it then also comes down to the exposure of what it comes down to compounds that you might be using to deter other insects, and making sure that beneficial insects like bees are not exposed at that same time, right? So a lot of the insecticides that you can buy over the counter, they have labels on them saying do not spray when bees are actively foraging and what they're around. And there's a reason for that, is because they're trying to protect the bees. So you really want to make sure that you follow the label on any of those different products to try to minimize and to mitigate any off-target effects like with bees.
I know I just came across a saying that says that cleanliness is next to antlessness, because ants are who like to share my home with me. Mm-hmm. And so that's a good way to deter. At least for us, if we keep our counters really clean and don't leave anything in the sink, then the ants are a lot fewer. Also, my husband has bought this tiny little vacuum that he uses to suck up the ants and take them outside. Yep. So some other tips. Okay. So Keith has a question. What is the baseline for bee mortality, that which we should be comfortable with? So on a scale of 1 to 10, how alarmed should we be about this bee mortality?
That's a great question. And again, I think it depends on whether we're talking about managed honeybees and native bees. I would actually give them different numbers. I would give it more like a 4 or 5 when it comes to honeybees. And I'd be much more alarmed when it comes to the native bees because we don't have as much providence over them. It's a lot. Those are much bigger landscape societal issues in order to try to help the native bees. So with honeybees, beekeepers are indeed facing real significant challenges, but they've been working within that system, and we know more about how to potentially fix that system. But with the native bees, there's so much that we don't know that it should be much more alarming.
All right. So Elise has a great question that I think I might have asked at one point. Do colonies of honeybees passing through for pollination compete for resources with local bees? And if so, what can we do to help the wild bees while keeping up necessary pollination for our food production?
Fantastic question. And this is, again, something where we need to work with growers and change our overall agricultural production system in order to accommodate. And the answer is that honeybee, like all bees, will compete for each other. So bringing in colonies of honeybees can, in fact, take away potential foraging opportunities for resident bees that are there. But if those resident bees that are there would never be able to pollinate all of the crops in a particular area, the growers need that surplus of bees. They can't just rely on building up these populations that over which they have little or no control. But once the honeybees are then taken away in these systems, those other bees still need something to eat. And so planting buffer habitat or other things that are blooming throughout the year for those native bees, that's the way to be able to build up their populations so that perhaps going forward, we might not need to bring in as many honeybees to augment the deficit of pollinators in the area. So having, again, thinking at the landscape level and thinking about the nutritional needs of bees throughout the year is really what it comes down to, so that it's not just a food desert for 50 months out of the year and only this monoculture for 2 years while that crop is in bloom. That's a great question.
All right, so Keith has another question. How did so many studies regarding CCD get published in the first place if they were faulty? And isn't there a peer review process before studies can be published to prevent this?
That's a great question. And the answer is that they're not faulty. It's that's the way that science works, right? You study a hypothesis, you do a test, you put it out there, it certainly is peer reviewed. But then, one of the hallmarks of good science is repeatability, to really make sure that one study was on solid footing, to make sure that it works in different contexts and in different ways. And so follow-up studies that are trying to ascertain whether or not a particular mechanism is indeed the underlying cause, sometimes it supports it, other times it refutes it. And so that's how science works, that back and forth and trying to understand these very complicated issues is how we get closer to the truth. So I wouldn't say that they're necessarily faulty. It's just that doing additional studies to try to see how robust these different chains of evidence are is how science works. And it just so happens that in this particular case, when we thought we had some breakthroughs, they seemed to be more like false alarms than they were the final smoking gun. So we're left then with the conclusion that there doesn't seem to be any one singular factor that's behind it, but it's much more complicated and nuanced.
All right. I love the science lesson. It's because it is so important. And I think that we all need to understand that we are constantly learning and constantly adding to our knowledge about everything as we approach the truth. So Elise has a really good question. What can someone do to help bees from a downtown apartment? Are there any bees to visit a bee hotel here?
You bet there are. You bet there are. Urban environments can be great places for bees to live, but if they're ground nesting, they don't do very well nesting in concrete, right? So providing them with nesting substrates, nesting habitats is a great place. But we as humans, we love to have flowering plants around all the time. So urban environments can actually have a greater diversity and even abundance of flowers throughout the entire year than what you might see, out in nature. So I think providing those places for bees to nest and planting flowering plants, especially during the summer dearth when there's really not a whole lot else out there blooming, both of those things can go a long way to helping all bees with the nutritional and reproductive needs that they have, even in urban areas.
That's awesome. And I have a question. So listening to all these amazing talks about bees throughout this Bug Fest, so I just want to confirm that if we want to do the most good for the world, that it is maybe not having honeybees in our backyard. Like I have backyard chickens, so I like it, like just like you say, I liken it to the same thing. So my chickens aren't always the best for the environment, right? And so what we really should be doing is planting the flowers, providing nest places. I know we've talked about keeping some bare earth patches in our yards if we're able to do that. So for the ground nesting bees and bee hotels. So I just want to, so do you think that is the path for most of us to just make the places we have control over as friendly to native arthropods? Exactly. I don't want to say just bees, right? Because all arthropods are important.
Exactly. If you want to save the songbirds, you don't keep chickens, right? Chickens have their own role, so don't be so hard on your chickens. They have a different role, right? And they are positive in other ways, but the mechanisms by which we help can be quite different. So to help all bees, honeybees included, it's about habitat and making sure that they have sufficient diet year round, right? But yeah, you're not going to save the native bees by keeping honeybees. The way to save the honeybees, or the way to mitigate their losses, is to be a better beekeeper and to manage them so that they're not going to be rife with these parasites and then die out from them. We need to be better stewards of the honeybees. But those are very, very different approaches for managed bees versus the wild bees.
Awesome. So let me just make sure. I think those are all our questions. This has been just such a fantastic program. Thank you so much for joining us for Bug Fest this year. And yeah, so if folks are interested in joining, we do have an arthropod conservation challenge. I put that in the chat, so feel free to email me and I will let you join the challenge. We have a whole list of activities you can do to conserve our little buggy friends out there. So please email me if you want to join. And I'm going to share my screen for our final. Let's see. All right. So you already had a preview of this because this is the slide I had up at the beginning. So I do want to thank all of you for joining us today, and Dr. Tarpey for giving us this wonderful program. I also want to thank BASF, who is our sponsor for Bug Fest this year. And I want to thank all of our museum members, because without you, we wouldn't be able to do programs like this. And if you are not yet a member, there is still a chance to join and get a free BugFest Plan B t-shirt. So there's instructions on how to do that on the slide, as well as you can always just go to bugfest.org and all the information is there as well. We have another whole day of virtual programs tomorrow, and another program this afternoon. And then on Saturday, we will have our pollination celebration from 9 to 12 out at our Prairie Ridge Eco Station, and a moth party Saturday night from 8:30 to 10:30 p.m. also at Prairie Ridge. So I will see you at another BugFest program. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.